Dr. Albright is an assistant professor of the practice in the Environmental Science and Policy Methods Nichols School of the Environment at Duke. And her research centers on resilience and local level response to extreme events. One of her research streams focuses on the role of public and stakeholder participation in local level decision-making processes surrounding issues of resilience and flood recovery. She's been awarded a Fulbright and a National Science Foundation grant to examine these issues, and her recent paper on post-Colorado flood stakeholder participation was recently awarded the Paul A. Sabatier Best Science, Technology, and Environmental Politics Paper Award at the American Political Science Association National Meeting. Betsy earned her undergraduate degree at the College of Worcester, an MPA and an MSES at the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, and her PhD at Duke. Today, she's going to be talking about public participation in resilience building, what we know, and where to go. Before I turn it over to Betsy, I want to just mention that if you have questions, the most organized way to do that with the webinar is through the chat function that you should be able to see across the top bar of your WebEx interface. So if you type in a chat question at the end, the coordinator here, Ann Kelly, or I will be reading those questions out to Betsy to respond to at the end of her talk. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Betsy to present her talk today on resilience building. Betsy?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for tuning in. I'm very excited for this opportunity to speak today about the role of the public and stakeholders in resilience building. And that is one stream of research that I'm focused on. And as Tom mentioned, I'm working on a Colorado project, have worked in Central Europe, and am now embarking through the SAGE project in the Caribbean. And so I do not claim to be a Caribbean expert, but more focused on public participation and resilience building, and hopefully will apply some of the things I've learned as well as others in that context moving forward. Okay. So I won't bore you again. Tom gave a comprehensive overview of my background. One thing that wasn't included is I was a research associate at DUSP, the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT under Joanne Carmen, the late Joanne Carmen. So I'd like to dedicate this talk today to all the wisdom she imparted when I had the opportunity to work for her. And so today I'll talk first about vulnerability, resilience, and learning. Focusing on my projects, both in Hungary and Colorado. You may ask, those aren't coastal. That's correct, they are not. But some of the lessons that we've learned from studying these participatory processes then can be applied with some caveats, perhaps, thinking about what lessons, and obviously it's very context dependent, but how these might apply in a Caribbean context, coastal context. And I posed some research questions moving forward to try to dig at what stakeholder participation processes are we seeing in the Caribbean, and two, how are they functioning? How are they driving or not driving resilience and adaptation, both to climate change, extreme events, and more slow onset effects of climate change, such as sea level rise. And then at the end, I'll take questions and comments. So I'll start broad in thinking about resilience. One form of resilience you see in the literature is socio-ecological resilience. Think, what does that mean? And really, I like to think of resilience as the ability of systems at different scales to absorb disturbances while maintaining function and processes, both of human and ecological systems. And this often calls for self-organization, diversity of mechanisms to deal with change, and the ability to adapt to uncertainty and learn from our experiences. So some feedback loops of capacity of learning, experiencing these changes, disturbances, and then learning from them. And how does that mechanism play out? And so that's really where my focus is this capacity for learning, and how can we encourage learning to better provide or develop or build resilient systems. So one aspect of this is social resilience, and this is really a term that I think is conflated in the literature to a fair amount. And I like to think of social resilience as the interactions between humans learning from each other. So peer-to-peer, social networks, learning about people, learning about environment, and coming to a construction of meaning or identity through these processes of learning through each other. And this often, drivers of social learning may include robust collective action institutions, diverse economic opportunities, local knowledge, social networks, and again, capacity for learning. So thinking about resilience of social systems, learning from each other, constructing meaning together, etc. And social resilience shouldn't be conflated, in my view, with stakeholder processes. Stakeholders, the involvement of individuals who are affected or may affect policy, is a difference. It may be a drawing, but it's two distinct things. You can have social learning without stakeholder involvement, and you can have stakeholder involvement that doesn't lead to social resilience. One framework that I like to think about is really the one Turner put out in 2003, so it's a bit old, but still it holds when thinking about vulnerability as exposure, sensitivity, and resilience, and the interactions between the two. And what I really appreciate about this framework is his situating the place, that box in gray, in a region and in the world, and trying to understand or at least recognize the relationships across scales and also across human conditions, environmental conditions, the coupling between the two. And we can drill down. I promise I wouldn't say drill down in this talk, but slide 5 I did. So vulnerability here is, again, exposure, sensitivity, and resilience. And the components of exposure includes frequency, magnitude, duration of the event. It's very timely today. We have a Category 5 hurricane sitting off the coast of Mexico. This morning I spent with the visiting mayor from the Philippines, who was key in the recovery of Typhoon Haiyan. And so really this is what we're talking about, these strong events, and how often they are, how strong they are, how long they last. And exposure also depends on who's being exposed, individuals, households, etc. And then sensitivity then is the coupling of the environmental conditions along with the human conditions, endowments, entitlements, institutions, the glue that holds society together, those structures that we develop. And then what I'm most interested in, is really the coping in that resilience box, the coping response, the extant programs that are already in existence, the policy, the autonomous options. I would put in that box processes, mechanisms for participation, and then adjustment and adaptation and response. So what comes from experiencing these events, or the exposure, the frequency, magnitude, and duration, and how that affects new programs, policy, and autonomous options. Another way to think about resilience and adaptation to climate is the time scale. Turner's depiction in that figure doesn't directly address the time scale, where Moser and Ekstrom's piece in 2010 does, and really thinks about the time and effort required to adapt to climate change, or the exposure to these extreme events. So you have kind of short-term measures, coping measures, that deal with climate change impacts now, and it may return to status quo. And that may take less time and effort than more substantial adjustments, or to the extreme system transformations, redesigning cities, redesigning coastal areas to become more resilient. So it's important to think about these adaptations and development of resilience in terms of effort and time, and in scale across time. So my focus in research, and we'll get to the studies in a bit, is really the role of learning and how learning affects resilience or not. And I see a gap in the literature in the understanding of the processes and arrangements that lead to policies to reduce community vulnerability to future events. Again, these events can be hurricanes, can be floods, earthquakes, etc. And then I also focus on the learning in the aftermath of disaster and how that then could play into policy-oriented learning and social learning. Social learning I defined earlier is the exchange, learning from individuals amongst themselves to come to some constructed meaning. And policy-oriented learning focuses on learning about policies, evaluating past policies, and potentially seeing shifts and changes in understanding of the problem behind the events. So learning and perhaps coming up with a new concept, conceptual understanding of the events. And then the potential drivers of social and policy learning I see is three things that I'm looking at. And today I'll just focus on openness and type of participatory processes. Also, really key is resource availability before the event, as well as shifts in resource availability after. So this can be financial, public opinion, technical knowledge, expertise, and then as well as risk perceptions and salience. And we'll talk a bit about how stakeholder processes differ and the ease of implementation differ in a post-extreme event context versus a building or adaptation without that increase in salience, and how that's often more challenging. And then just the broad question, it's good to keep in mind, why do I care? Why do we care globally about involving stakeholders in resilience building processes, adaptation processes? And this, I argue that there's two reasons. One, a more normative principle of democracy and participation. And these have been encoded in Article 6 of the 1992 UNFCCC, Third Assessment Report, UNDP. And there's also, and I can understand in some contexts why the normal principle of participation may not hold, but they're also instrumental purpose for encouraging involvement of stakeholders and the public in resilience building. And one, and what I'll talk about today, is the potential for encouraging policy learning and change. That feedback loop, learning from experience to become more resilient going forward. And it can promote change in individual risk mitigation behaviors, increases the use of local knowledge, blending both expert knowledge and local knowledge, place-based knowledge, local efforts. It may also increase buy-in for changes in policy if you involve the community, the public, the stakeholders early on in the process, and increase ease of implementation. Now, these are all idealized goals. Ideally, this is what happens. It doesn't always play out like this, but there is argument for instrumental purposes of involving public and stakeholders in decision-making processes regarding resilience. And then one last framework picture here is the how. What do I mean by stakeholder processes? And there are a slew of stakeholder processes, both within the U.S. and across the globe. And these really depend on scale, on process design, on the political institution context in which these collaborative processes or stakeholder processes are built. And Ansel and Gash offer this design of collaborative, or a depiction of collaborative process, which may include trust building, commitment to the process, a shared understanding, and face-to-face dialogue. May include facilitative leadership, and in our case here, the outcome may be resilience, influence of resilience. And it's also important to think of these collaborative processes as set in starting conditions. And these, could be a context of cooperation and conflict, political culture, culture writ large, in in a particular region, incentives for participation, inequities, asymmetries across stakeholders in terms of power, knowledge, access to the process, etc. So it's important to keep in mind these collaborative processes are embedded in a context, and we need to think about that context as well. So getting to the questions that animate or motivate the research that I do. And one is, how do learning processes, and more specifically, the degree of openness of stakeholder and participatory processes, differ across communities in a post-flood context? And then, how do policy change and learning vary across communities based on extent of flood damage or just damage in general, resource availability, and degree of openness of decision-making processes? So now I'm going to take a sip of water, and then I will embark on my case number one of flooding in Hungary. So I was fortunate enough to win both a Fulbright and a small National Science Foundation grant to study resilience in the face of extreme flood events in Hungary. And for those of you that may not know, Hungary sits at the bottom of the Carpathian Basin in Central Europe and has had intermittent extreme flooding for centuries. About 200 years ago, they really drained the wetlands for the hope of large-scale agriculture and managed their rivers primarily by gray infrastructure. And floods continued, intermittent floods. And then early in the late 1990s, early 2000s, Hungary experienced a series of 1,000-year flood levels, and back-to-back, some 500 years, some 1,000 year. And at the same time, Hungary was shifting from the state socialist regime to a more democratic process, and also joining in to the European Union. And with that, there was opening of venues for participation. Previously, there was less participation, open forums, open venues for participation in river management during the last, say, 50 years or so. And then, so you have that coupled with a series of extreme events. And basically, here's a quote from one of my interview subjects. I interviewed, I think, over 300, or no, sorry, whoa, that would take forever. No, 30 NGOs/government officials. I did a survey of 200 mayors throughout Hungary to inform my work. And here's one quote that I found particularly compelling. That's, I think the main role was played by Mr. A, who was state secretary at the time, who was responsible for water management, and his deputy, Mr. B. And he was the one that told us, if you know what you want, then come and tell us. So it was really uncommon for the Hungarian system because you very rarely got heard. And this, bringing in experts and having a forum in which NGOs, the public, could speak to water management experts who are historically and typically engineers in more support of gray management of the rivers, we really started to see, or they really started to see, shifts in how they managed the rivers. And when I say a shift towards a more, I would say, use of green infrastructure, which allowed for more natural river flow and kind of agriculture based off a more natural flow of the river. And so really saw a shift in thinking broadly about how rivers should be managed. And I argue in the paper that this really stemmed from this opening of venues for participation, as well as joining the European Union along with the floods that occurred. And it wasn't just the floods, but these shifts in the broader context in which these floods occurred. So that's just a quick overview of the lessons learned from the floods in Hungary and what were the key motivators for a shift in how one deals with extreme events in river management. So I'll now move on to my second case. And this is post-flood public and stakeholder engagement in Colorado. About 2 years ago, last month, Colorado received over 17 inches of rain over a 3-day period. Again, this is a 1,000-year probability event in terms of precipitation. This occurred mostly in northern Colorado in the Front Range. And sorry, I'm just getting a message, but I can't see it. Hope y'all can hear me. So what we did, my colleague Desiree Crow at Colorado CU Boulder, Colorado University Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, wrote an NSF proposal and were awarded an NSF to study 7 communities that were flooded across 3 counties. And for this paper, what we did is we wanted to investigate the relationship between open governance, the number, the type, the venue of meetings held, the variation in public input, and how that linked to policy learning and change and resilience. And so I spent 2 summers ago, rented a house on the coast, encoded 773 documents over a 30-day period. It was tons of fun. So anyways, I coded 27 documents a day. We also conducted recovery stakeholder interviews. And again, I'm defining stakeholders here as individuals or groups who are interested and affected by or can affect a certain policy issue or policy. So basically, a case who was affected by floods or who could affect flood policies, whether that's open space management, river corridor restoration, or housing, for example. And so we spoke to key individuals who managed or led participatory processes. And again, I did this work, and I'm currently doing this work. We have 2.5 years left on the grant with Desiree Crow of CU Boulder. So the findings here, this photos here are from the town of Lyons, a small town in the Front Range. And that was very much, not to put too harsh words on it, the town center and much of the residential areas were destroyed. And so what they did is they formed a series of task force, and they had a kickoff meeting. Here's a quote from one of the stakeholders. We had our kickoff meeting, and we invited the entire public. We did door-to-door flyers, hand-delivered to every person, saying we want your input. And last night, we had about 500 there. Lyons is a town of about 2,000. So a quarter of the town showing up for a meeting post-disaster on how to redesign the town going forward. So what we see or have seen across these communities is a diversity of stakeholder and public participation processes. These vary from public meetings, online information collection, neighborhood-based meetings, flood task force, council meetings where the public came and gave input, etc. So we're seeing a diversity of stakeholder and public participation processes. And really this, if we think about SAGE and the gradient scheme, is also a gradient in the breadth of participants. Some towns really focused on just kind of a managerial approach to post-disaster recovery, focusing on government officials. Moving to the right, you have expert involvement, civil society orgs, and then more broadly, general public that we saw in the town of Lyons, where task force were made of individuals volunteering from the public to be on these task forces, flood task force. And we also see a gradient in role of participants. And this also is very in line with Arnstein's work in the 1960s, Fung's work on kind of the democracy cube. And really we're seeing different depths of deliberation and different intensity of what the stakeholders' role was. So it ranged from none, providing information, providing comments on policies, an advisory role, offering advice, up to developing policies, and deliberation, really thinking about in-depth discussions of goals and strategies at the community level and how to move forward. So we're seeing these stakeholder public roles very different across the communities. And so our question really is, how do these differences in both breadth of participants and role of participants matter in terms of resilience building, or in terms of learning, which then we argue goes to resilience building? And so we then coded all of the documents, again, the 773 such documents. And after we'd done with that, had a stiff drink and thought about what this all meant. And really, we're seeing outcomes both in policy change and then in learning and resilience. And these go from no change to focus on repair, really. So enabling policies on bureaucratic modifications to enable repair. And these are outcomes at the community level, those 7 communities that we examined. And then several of the communities examined, conducted studies on effects of floods, flood damage, etc. Many then went on to develop policies focused on warning systems and immediate response. How do you let people know? How do you let the public know? How do you get them out of there in the risks way? Fewer cities reached what we got to the reduce risk. Policies, plans, infrastructure revised to reduce risk of future flood damage. So this could be anywhere from buying out homes in the floodplain to making water supply systems redundant and changing infrastructure to make sure that if it does go down, it can be more quickly put back in place. And then redesign, we see as something much more complex and systemic across the community. And this is, again, increasing redundancy, kind of building on reducing risk, but also 2 of the communities redeveloped their river corridors, removing infrastructure out of the corridors and developing kind of parks, wetlands, etc., to absorb the flooding if it were to occur again. And then we get to policy learning, social learning, and resilience, which we've talked about before. So what we saw, then linking the types of participation to these outcomes of public and stakeholder of policy change and learning, and we did see some linkages, and our hypotheses were confirmed to some extent, saying that extent and type of flood damage, resource available, pre and post flood, and past practices influence the type of participatory process. Fairly logical, commonsensical result. And we also saw that learning and change varies in a positive sense on openness, depth of deliberation, and damage. And so we're seeing that the more damaged cities had more extensive public participation. We also thought that resources would matter. How much money is available, money, technical resources, human capacity resources, in terms of policy change. And this didn't play out, surprisingly to me. Some of the least resourced cities really had greater policy change. Although to get the policy change, they did not rely on government officials. They brought in stakeholders. They brought in the public to run these flood task force, and had greater openness, depth of deliberation, and damage, part because of pre-flood practices, cultural norms of participation in these communities, as well as the need, high damage, high loss of resource. You need to involve people outside of the government in order to get things done, to reconceptualize the cities. One thing we did see is that cities that are more highly resourced, in particular Boulder, Colorado, did produce a greater number of studies. And so many more studies on floodplain mapping, flood modeling, etc., was directly linked to resources. And then finally, the greater depth and breadth of participatory processes are associated with in a positive sense, an extent of policy change. So saying that the more in-depth and the wider array of individuals that were in the participatory process are associated with the extent of policy change. We argue that an increase or a diversity of voices were able to be heard, potentially involving social learning, particularly in the community of Lions, where they had weekly meetings across task forces, where individuals could learn from each other, both stakeholders, government officials, to really reconceptualize what the river means to the town and how to go forward. And again, these findings are from two papers, Albright and Crow, 2015, A and B. And I don't mean, even though we see greater depth and breadth of participatory processes linked with policy change, that it's not all easy. It's not a rose garden. There are challenges, particularly in a non-post-disaster context. I've touched on a few of these, but really challenges of involving stakeholders in a post-disaster context is power differentials among stakeholders, access both to public officials, to each other, to resources, to technical information, lack of information, interest, and salience. We didn't see this in the post-flood Colorado context, but does play out in trying to get adaptation measures developed and adopted in a non-post-disaster context. There's also regulatory and institutional barriers to stakeholder involvement. This really played out in the Hungary example, where there wasn't a cultural norm of public participation in these decisions. It was a very managerial top-down structure over the past 50 years, and that shift in the political institutions allowed for some opening, but it was challenging. And then political norms and barriers. Past negative experiences. Individuals may have participated in stakeholder involvements and nothing came of it in the past and may be very hesitant to participate in the future. Public apathy goes along potentially with salience. Hey, why should I care about climate change going into the future if it's not affecting me today? Perceived lack of voice and cultural norms of who participates, who should participate. You know, this can be across different segments of society, gender, etc. there. And then thinking about it and thinking about deliberation in a participatory process, pulling from Few et al. In 2007, and this gets to the point that if there's not a disaster, how does the stakeholder process play out? And some of their conclusions are, and I'll read from the slide here, is an open participatory process that sees a genuine voice to stakeholders on fundamental decisions is appropriate if the purpose is to define overall priorities for society or to galvanize broad-based deliberation of climate change issues. They argue that really it's best to involve stakeholders in this participatory process moving forward, not a reactionary, as in the two cases I presented, is when you want to develop broad goals for society. What does the public want in this kind of broad-based deliberation of climate change issues? And they also say that it may also function effectively if and when climate impacts begin to have tangible effects on environment and society as a decision process for reactive adaptation. So again here, the salience issue. If stakeholders in the public are motivated, perhaps their risk perceptions go up because of experiencing events, they may be more willing to participate in such a process. So it may, stakeholders, as seen in my research in Hungary and Colorado, the reactive adaptation may be effective more so than kind of participatory or anticipatory. And then finally, public involvement in anticipatory planning. Even if some stakeholders may be supportive of anticipatory intervention, the outcome of deliberation is unlikely to produce a consensus strategy to address long-term and uncertain consequences with low immediate salience. So again, concerns about involving the public in these processes when planning for the future without a motivating event. And so again, kind of questions there about the role of salience and ability to involve public in long-term and uncertain consequences. So really focusing to adaptation to climate change, we have lack of sustained interest or focus may be problematic. These are barriers or challenges to engagement, low salience, credibility and trust of officials, complexity of science and uncertainty, and a mismatch of information between scientists, decision makers, and public, and a potential lack of local capacity, resources, and institutions. And then on top of the challenges to engagement and adaptation to climate change, you have more specific coastal resilience context challenges as well. And oftentimes coastal resilience issues deal with multi-levels of governance. And you need to coordinate across multiple levels of governance. So you have the local, which may feel the disturbance or experience that exposure, but also policies can be formed and may conflict with other levels of governance. So something that needs to take account of, as well as a lack of integration of policies across sectors, coastal zone management, etc. And then also in the literature mentioned inadequate data. So really future scenario building and how to downscale climate models to a specific coastal region. And what's the risk information that's available and site specific. And then finally, lack of public awareness, thinking about coastal resilience, lack of salience without an extreme event, etc. So challenges to the adaptation and coastal resilience context. And then we also, in the Caribbean, getting to the application to the Caribbean context now, is we also have small island state, or in some cases, small island developing state contexts in the Caribbean. And these islands have greater exposure to extreme climatic events, heavy reliance, oftentimes, not always, on natural resources, limited land resource, they're an island, and often limited opportunity to diversify economies. Maybe there's tourist industry, maybe there's a strong shipping industry, but historically has had a harder time diversifying economies across a number of sectors. And then, so now shifting a little bit to vulnerabilities in the Caribbean and thinking about what type of resilience building is needed and what are kind of the challenges or these vulnerabilities. And so in the literature, I found both kind of ecosystem-driven vulnerabilities as well as human-driven vulnerabilities. And if we think back to the diagram we looked at first, really the coupling of the human and ecosystems or environment systems. And this could be freshwater availability, marine and coastal ecosystems, bleaching of coral reefs, acidification of the sea, degradation of mangrove forests, which may temper or dampen the effects or the exposure of extreme events or hurricanes coming in. Coastal flooding, hurricanes, sea level rise, and then really thinking about the Caribbean in terms of multiple hazards, repeated hazards, both slow onset and quick onset. So sea level rise coupled with hurricanes, infrastructure concerns, poverty in some nations, inequities across the population in terms of access to public, access to officials, etc. Environmental degradation and mentioned before, limited economic diversification. So I dug through the literature over the past month or so and to really look at what Caribbean studies are out there on stakeholder involvement. And I found three streams that were most prevalent in the literature, one being kind of co-management of fisheries. Coral, where a lot of the studies focused on the political will to involve stakeholders and local level management of fisheries, and fisheries working with government officials fairly successfully. Coral reef management, and a study, interesting study by Turner et al. 2014 on the public perception of good governance, and then some studies on community-based management, role of networks in adaptation, focus on resilience of ecosystems. There's a couple of studies looking at resilience and the role of stakeholders, one being the promotion of resilience in the Cayman Islands by Tompkins and Adger, and really focused on social learning, diversity of adaptations, mechanisms for collective action, and exposure to impacts. And while there may be lots of evidence in the white literature of stakeholder processes occurring in the Caribbean around issues of resilience building, there aren't as many studies in the academic literature. And I think that really provides an interesting opportunity to dig at the role of the public, the role of stakeholders in building resilience and thinking about it in a cross-nation Caribbean context moving forward. And so what we know here in a broader kind of outside the Caribbean context is that stakeholders, just to summarize where I've gone so far, stakeholder and public participation mechanisms vary on who participates, how they participate in the design of the participation mechanism. Also, you could argue, or I would argue, to some extent, taking into account the context, that participation matters to resilience building and adaptation. Stakeholders, public, seems to be some link, maybe not always, likely not always, context dependent on resilience building. And then to stress some of the disconnect between post-disaster participation and adaptation planning. And so thinking about public participation and the role of resilience in both a post-disaster and a adaptation planning context. And then to not stress enough is the context of place matters. The institutions, the broader institutions matter. As Turner sketched out in his diagram, we have place situated in region, situated, across the world. And each of those levels or scales matters in terms of how the stakeholder process is designed, the architecture, and then cultural impacts, socioeconomic, political impacts on the effectiveness of stakeholder processes going forward. And so really to conclude, we have at this point much to learn, especially in resilience building and adaptation processes, about the role of stakeholders and public in developing these resilience building exercises. So to think further about research questions moving forward, I think it would be really interesting, and folks, if in the Caribbean, if you're all online, I'd really like to hear your thoughts on these and how these ideas might mesh with the Caribbean context across island states. Is what mechanisms of stakeholder engagement and public participation occur in projects aimed to increase coastal resilience? Do they vary across gradient of pre-disaster, post-disaster, across program type, funding source, local, regional focus, and across political context, so across nations? And then what forms of stakeholder engagement and public participation have been most successful in developing resilience in the Caribbean? Again, the key here is, one, we would need to define successful. And this gets to some of the work of indicators, coastal resilience indicators. We could talk about successful in terms of social resilience, coastal resilience, ecosystem resilience. So thinking about how we would measure that, and then thinking about what forms of stakeholder engagement, from a normative standpoint to some extent, would engage in public participation. And then what barriers, challenges prevent engagement and participation. And luckily, scanning through the literature, and I'll close up in a few, is there are many projects going on at different levels in the Caribbean about vulnerability reduction, climate change resilience, pilot programs that I believe are ripe for study, for where we could learn from these processes, differences in how they are engaging the public, engaging stakeholders, and seeing if that matters in terms of the outcomes, in terms of resilience and vulnerability reductions. There are regional initiatives, CPAC, mainstreaming adaptation to climate change, Caribbean climate change tourism and livelihoods, many different regional initiatives, and it's probably only scratching the surface here. That I think would be a really interesting kind of cross-case comparison, as well as national and local coastal resilience programs. Just looked at Jamaica, Barbados, what they have going on, different programs for hazard risk reduction, coastal risk and management programs. And so steps forward I see are really to develop, first off, and I have a research assistant working on this, a database of coastal Caribbean or Caribbean coastal resilience projects, diving into the academic literature, the gray literature, the white papers, to try to dig out what all is going on and by whom. And then figuring out what stakeholder public participation are in these. And then from that, I think a really collect or develop case studies across regions, multiple countries, multiple cases within countries, where we would seek variation in public stakeholder participation mechanisms and type of coastal resilience projects, and we would attempt to explain the outcome of various resilience indicators to try to tease out really what is the role of public and stakeholders across these projects, and how is that linked to the development of resilience in the Caribbean context, in specific national contexts, as well as specific local contexts. So just trying to dig that out. I think a really kind of in-depth case study comparison, perhaps along with some survey broadly, could really strengthen the literature in this area, which I'm finding not Caribbean specific, but globally, to be a paucity of studies linking public and stakeholder participation to resilience development. And here are the references. And now I will shut up and take questions, comments, hear your thoughts. So thank you for this opportunity. And I'm going to
Betsy, thank you so much. This is Tom Sheen again in Boston, and we do have some questions. I wasn't sure if we could unmute Elizabeth Hammond at UMass Amherst, because she did have a couple of questions for you. So, Elizabeth, I don't know if Anne can try to unmute you, or otherwise I can read the questions, but let's see how we do.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Hi, Elizabeth.
Great. Hi, Betsy. So my first sort of big picture question is whether you differentiate the public from stakeholders, because from my perspective, they serve, and we can expect them to serve, two really different functions, where stakeholders often have more, well, I'm going on to answer my question, but from your perspective,
yes,
I'm curious to hear how you view the public versus stakeholders. You sort of mush them together, but I bet you actually think of them as different things.
Yes, I actually think of them as different and serving different roles. The roles may vary, but I see the public as representing themselves in these processes, whereas a stakeholder often represents a group of individuals with a particular agenda, and that's like by definition how I think of them differently. And then they may act in different ways in terms of these processes and also serve as different roles. So public in these processes often provide comment and are less kind of involved in deliberation, where we may see that more with stakeholders. But that didn't hold true, say, in the Lyons, Colorado case, where the public really served on flood task force. They divided them up, had 7 flood task force, and so you had public serving on housing recovery in Lyons. And so that's almost a hybrid, although the individuals where the public are often representing themselves and not a group.
Yeah, good. It'd be really interesting to think about the difference between those two, the collaborative process versus the necessarily more limited input of the public.
Right.
My sense is that they belong in different spheres, and I think you're saying that too. Although maybe in the maybe that's where the salience question really comes in, that when it's a really salient issue, when there's been a disaster, then people are more likely to really engage as the public.
Right. And we saw that in some communities, the public, and it was very topically based. So the public in Boulder post-flood became very activated, but mostly in the realm of open space and open trails. Hundreds of comments coming in, when are the trails going to be open, etc. Very kind of culturally driven by the culture, the outdoors, athletic culture of Boulder. And whether or not those individuals or the public are speaking on behalf of their running group, I think that's where the lines kind of, blur perhaps between public and stakeholder. But yeah, I think it's really important, and I agree. In this talk, I kind of conflated the two. In the paper, it's a little bit more separated out. But
great. Can I ask one more question before we move to other people?
Sure.
That's cool with me.
I was curious, in the slide on the different implementation steps, where you were trying to link the impact of how much that one. Mm-hmm. Do you view those as in effect, a ladder that you start with no change and then you go to repair and then you go to examine? Or is that more of a menu that different communities are choosing from?
I would say it's more, and I don't even know if it's a menu communities are choosing from, but we coded all of the policies that each community adopted post-flood and categorized them. And so some communities may, almost all had some degree of repair. Fewer had redesign. You don't necessarily need to have new warnings to get to redesign. So, it could be, they could fall in these different categories. And this is actually from a conference, the APSA paper, and we're kind of reconceptualizing it as we push it forward. And I would love comments here. But no, I don't see it necessarily as a linear continuum there. But outcomes that communities displayed.
Good, thanks.
So, Betsy, this is Tom again. I think I have sort of a similar question, but I think I'm going to ask it like an engineer would ask it, which is that it seems like right now a lot of your work has, and maybe I'm mischaracterizing, but it seems like it's been more, it's been a lot of data gathering on how this participation has gone. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if this is now going to move further on to a place which I think is a little like Elizabeth's question, where we might be able to do more modeling or pre-planning before you actually go in and try to do public participation somewhere, that you take all the possible or many of these factors to the level and type of participation, mm-hmm. and that you could start to model or strategize the best way to do that in a particular place. Are we there yet, or is that a place where you would go after more experience with these kinds of things?
I think that would be a really interesting way to go. I don't know if we have enough studies out there in the varying, controlling for all the factors that matter, or accounting, not necessarily controlling, but accounting for all the factors that may matter. And so, I think to get there, that would be great, especially like in the Caribbean context. But right now, there's so few kind of studies on participation in the context of resilience building. There's lots of more studies on fisheries management, on coastal, on coral reef management, but less so on this kind of resilience, climate change adaptation. And so, and then in my idealized world, I would love to do an experimental design where we take a context, design randomly across cases what type of stakeholder process would occur, and then, be able to draw more conclusions because of that design, but that's not particularly feasible. But yeah, I think that's really kind of the way to go.
And that's the sense I have from other fields, like you've mentioned, and also I think in the environmental health field, they've done more of this, so they have more of a sort of a roadmap of how to get someplace with community-based participation, and it's just because there's more history with it, I think, at this point. So
right. I mean, there's a lot of tons and tons of paper on how to design stakeholder processes, how to design public input. There's less in the context of climate change, less in the context of post-disaster. So that's really kind of the new aspect there, and what works, what doesn't, what hasn't worked.
Great. We're a little bit past the 2 o'clock Eastern time hour, so I'm gonna hold the other questions at this point. But I assume, Betsy, you're welcome to people emailing you if they have other questions about the presentation. And I wanted to mention that, again, this is the SAGE project that has hosted this today. I want to thank Dr. Albright for presenting. It was a terrific and very apropos talk to our idea of gradients in the coastal environment. It seemed like every other slide we talked about some level of gradient. So that was great to have you speak on those different aspects. So thank you once again, Dr. Albright, and this was hosted by the SAGE Research Coordination Network, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. And if you would like to see this talk again, or look back and see what was said on particular slides, it will be posted to our YouTube channel, which we have, and you can reach that off of the project website, which is www.resilient-infrastructure.org. So again, Betsy, thank you so much for speaking today to the group. And the next webinar will be in probably the first Friday in December. We will have Dr. Brian McAdoo from the Yale National University of Singapore speaking on cultural and place-based specifics of adaptation. So also a good complement to today's talk. So again, thank you, Dr. Albright, and thank you to attendees for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Tom. And if people want to reach me via email, it's elizabeth.albright@duke.edu.
Great. Thanks, Betsy. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Hey, Elizabeth, if you're still on, just want to thank you. That was really great.
How to aim it. I've been muted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure how to pitch it, but yeah.
No, your work is really exciting, and if it's okay with you, I'll send you a couple things, including the paper I did, but also, and maybe going forward more interestingly, a grant application that we put in, Paul Kirshner and I and a couple other people that are looking at case studies. And some of that is, it's more the built form choices, but we're proposing with a colleague here at UMass who's a resource economist to do some field experiments in participation in coastal planning, resiliency planning.
Very cool.
And we're thinking about, there's another grant opportunity coming up in February that we might be looking at to repackage that and put it in, and it might be interesting for you given your work.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I actually ran into an article of yours, Australia, which I found really interesting as I was digging through stuff.
Yeah, it's funny, that's probably the 2007 one.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah. This is good. Are you still on, Tom? Oh, Tom's gone. Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm here. Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Good.
All right. Well, I need to write an NSF review due by 5, so I better go get on that.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Betsy.
But
Appreciate it.
Thank you. And any information you can send Elizabeth would be much appreciated.
Okay, cool.
All right. Thank you.